There are 1,000 different kinds of silence, but the silence of a house the day after its heart has stopped beating is a category all its own. It's a heavy, suffocating thing. A physical presence that smothers sound and memory alike. My husband, Liam, had been gone for 24 hours, his death from a sudden, shocking heart attack at 42, leaving a crater in the center of my world. The silence was his absence, a void where his laughter, his voice, his steady, comforting presence used to be. I was standing in our kitchen, staring at the coffee maker, trying to remember the sequence of steps required to make it function. When the phone rang, its shrill, artificial cry was a violation of the sacred quiet. I looked at the caller ID. It was his mother, Margaret. My heart sank. The long goodbye to my husband was over, and the long, final battle with his family was just beginning. This story is about grief, and about greed. It's about the people who show up with casseroles, and the people who show up with calculators, ready to tabulate your life's worth the moment it ends. If you have ever had to navigate a family dynamic that turned toxic in the face of a tragedy, if you've had to smile through your tears while people who are supposed to love you are quietly trying to erase you, then you know the kind of psychological warfare I was in. Give this video a thumbs up if you've been in those trenches. From the moment I met Liam's family 10 years ago, I was a problem they couldn't solve. He was a history professor, a man who lived in the world of ideas and books, a man who had inherited a significant family fortune but had little interest in its trappings. I was a landscape architect, a woman who worked with her hands, who built things from the earth up, to his mother, Margaret, a woman whose primary occupation was managing her social standing, and his younger sister, Charlotte, a woman whose primary occupation was spending the family money. I was a curiosity at best, and a threat at worst. They never saw me as Liam's partner. They saw me as his hobby, a temporary, middle-class diversion. Their disapproval wasn't loud or aggressive. It was a campaign of 1,000 tiny, paper-cut insults, delivered with a polite smile. It was Margaret looking at the garden I had spent a year designing and saying, "How lovely, dear. It's amazing what one can do with such a rustic sensibility." It was Charlotte, upon hearing I had won a design award, saying, "Oh, that's so sweet. Liam must be so proud of your little projects." Their favorite theme, the one they returned to again and again, was money. They could not comprehend a world where I loved Liam for who he was, not for his trust fund. They saw me as a gold digger, a clever operator who had sunk her hooks into their family's fortune. I'll never forget a dinner about 3 years into our marriage. We were at their country club, celebrating their anniversary. Liam had just given a beautiful, heartfelt toast to his parents. Then Charlotte, flushed with champagne, raised her glass to me. "And here's to Eliza," she'd said, her smile a little too wide. "The woman who proved that love really can conquer all. I mean, who else could get a man like my brother, who has a literal fortune, to spend his weekends helping you plant shrubs? At least if anything ever happens to him, God forbid, you'll be set for life." The table went quiet. The insult was so brazen, so nakedly transactional. I felt the blood drain from my face. But Liam had not hesitated. He had put his own glass down with a firm click. "That's enough, Charlotte," he'd said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. "You will not speak to my wife that way. Her work has more integrity and brings more beauty into the world than your credit card bills ever will. Apologize to her, now." Charlotte had been shocked into silence, and Margaret had quickly swooped in to smooth things over. But the message had been sent. Liam had defended me. He had always defended me. He was my shield against them. But now, my shield was gone, and the wolves were at the door. In the days between his death and his funeral, our house, my house, became their command center. Margaret and Charlotte swept in, their grief performing itself in loud, theatrical sighs and dabbing at dry eyes, all while they systematically began to erase me from the narrative of my husband's life. "The flowers, of course, must be white lilies," Margaret announced. On the phone with the funeral home, "Liam always adored lilies." "He hated lilies," I said, my voice hoarse from crying. "He was allergic. He loved the wild, unruly look of sunflowers." Margaret gave me a pitying look, the kind you give a hysterical child, dear. You're grieving. Your memory is playing tricks on you. He adored lilies. It's settled. She took over everything, the music, the catering for the reception, the casket. Every choice she made was a small assertion of her power, a quiet statement that he was her son first, and my husband a distant second. The most brutal cut came with the obituary. Charlotte wrote it. She read it aloud to me, her voice full of false solemnity. It was a beautiful tribute, listing his academic achievements, his charitable work, his devotion as a son and a brother. "It's beautiful," I whispered when she finished, "but you didn't mention me." She looked at me, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "Oh, my goodness, you're right. How silly of me. I was so focused on his childhood and his accomplishments. It must have just slipped my mind." I'll add it in. It hadn't slipped her mind. It was a calculated omission, a test, a way to see if I had the strength to fight for my own existence in the story of my husband's life. I made her add it, my voice shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. It was my first battle in a war I didn't want to fight. Through it all, I held on to one thing, a secret, a promise, a final act of partnership between me and the man I loved. About a year before he died, after the particularly nasty incident at the country club, Liam and I had a long, difficult conversation. He was so angry at his family, and so tired of fighting the same battles over and over again. "They'll never change, will they?" he'd said, his head in his hands. "They'll never see you for who you are. They'll always see you as a temporary fixture, as someone who is after the money." He looked at me, his eyes full of a sad, weary resolve. "And I worry about what they'll do if anything ever happens to me. I don't want them to hurt you. Eliza, I don't want them to spend years dragging you through court, trying to contest the will and paint you as a villain." "They won't," I had said, trying to reassure him. "The will is ironclad. You left everything to me. It's simple." "To people like us, it's simple," he'd replied. "To people like them. A will is the opening bell for a fight. But I have an idea. It's a little unorthodox, but I think it's the only way to protect you. The only way to make sure they are finally, truly held accountable for their behavior." The next day, we had gone to see our estate lawyer, a kind, wise old man named Mr. Abernathy, and together, the three of us had drafted a special, secret codicil to Liam's will, a final chapter that only we knew about. Liam had called it his morality clause, a final test for his family, and a final, posthumous act of love for me. It was our secret weapon, a time bomb waiting to be detonated by his family's own bad behavior. Holding on to the knowledge of that clause was the only thing that got me through the waking nightmare leading up to the funeral. It was the only reason I could nod politely as Margaret changed the flower order to the lilies he hated. It was the only reason I could listen to Charlotte forget my name in his obituary. I wasn't being passive, I was being patient. I was letting them build the case against themselves. The morning of the funeral was cold and gray, a perfect reflection of my heart. I stood in front of my closet, trying to decide what to wear to bury my husband. Charlotte had suggested I wear a simple black dress. Nothing too flashy, dear. We want the focus to be on Liam, not on us. I chose a dress of deep, defiant crimson. It was the dress I had worn on our first date. Liam had loved it. He'd said it was the color of life and passion. Wearing it to his funeral was my own quiet, personal rebellion, a statement that they could not erase the vibrant, passionate love we had shared. As I got ready, I was filled with a sense of profound, gut-wrenching dread, not just for the sadness of saying a final goodbye to the love of my life, but because I knew what was coming. I knew that in a few short hours, I would have to sit in the front pew of a church filled with hundreds of people and listen to my husband's family, deliver a eulogy that would pretend the last 10 years of his life, the 10 years he had spent with me, had never happened. I would have to endure their final, most public insult. I would have to let them try to erase me one last time. My grief was a vast, black ocean, but deep beneath the surface, there was a small, hard, unshakable stone of resolve. I would let them have their moment. I would let them deliver their speeches and tell their stories. I would sit there in my red dress, a silent, erased wife, and I would let them think they had won, because I knew something they didn't. I knew that the final word on Liam's life wouldn't be spoken at his funeral. It would be spoken in a lawyer's office. And it wouldn't be their word. It would be ours. The day of Liam's funeral was a study in gray. The sky was a flat, unforgiving slate. The air was cold and damp. And the mourners who filled the old stone church were a somber sea of black. I sat in the front pew, a place of honor that felt like a pillory. On my right was Margaret, his mother, her back ramrod straight, her face a mask of tragic, noble grief. On my left was Charlotte, his sister, dabbing at her dry eyes with a black lace handkerchief. I was the widow, but I was positioned between them like a prisoner. The three of us performing the role of a grieving family for the hundreds of eyes watching us. The air was thick with the cloying, funereal scent of lilies. The flowers I had explicitly asked them not to order. The flowers Liam had been allergic to. The entire church was overflowing with them. A final, fragrant insult from his mother. I stared at the dark, polished wood of my husband's casket at the front of the church, and I tried to focus on him. I tried to fill my mind with memories of his laugh, of the way he'd look at me over the top of a book, of the warmth of his hand in mine. But it was hard to find him through the fog of their suffocating presence. The service began. The minister spoke of Liam's kindness, his intellect, his quiet spirit. It was a lovely, generic tribute to a man he had met only twice. And then, it was time for the eulogies. From the family. Charlotte went first. She walked to the pulpit with a practiced, sorrowful grace, a single sheet of paper trembling in her hand. My brother, Liam, she began. Her voice thick with emotion, was my first friend and my lifelong protector. She proceeded to tell a series of charming, funny anecdotes from their childhood. She told the story of him teaching her to ride a bike, of them building a treehouse in their backyard, of him defending her from a bully in middle school. They were sweet stories, designed to paint a picture of an unbreakable sibling bond. But they were all half-truths. I knew the real versions. As she spoke of the treehouse, I remembered Liam telling me how he had built it, mostly by himself, while Charlotte had sat inside, complaining about the splinters. As she spoke of him defending her from a bully, I remembered his version, where he'd had to intervene because Charlotte had started the fight in the first place. He had loved his sister, but he was not blind to her flaws. The man she was describing was a two-dimensional saint, a character in a play she had written. As we grew up, she continued, her gaze sweeping the pews, Liam was always the brilliant one, the steady one. He dedicated his life to his work, to his books, and to his family. She looked at Margaret. He was the most devoted son a mother could ever ask for. He adored her. She was, and always will be, the most important woman in his life. A murmur of sympathy went through the church. I felt my hands clench into fists in the lap of my crimson dress. The erasure had begun. 10 years of marriage, of partnership, of a life we had built together, dismissed in a single, sweeping statement. She spoke for 10 minutes, and in those 10 minutes, she crafted a biography of her brother that managed to leap directly from his university days to his final illness, completely bypassing the entire decade he had spent with me, according to Charlotte's eulogy. Her brother had been a brilliant, devoted son and brother who had, for 10 years, apparently lived as a scholarly monk, with no wife, no partner, no love of his own. When she finished, she returned to the pew, her performance complete. She took Margaret's hand, the two of them a portrait of shared, exclusive grief. Then it was Margaret's turn. She approached the pulpit not with a piece of paper, but with an air of immense, sorrowful authority. She was not here to read a speech. She was here to hold court, to speak of my son. Liam, she began, her voice a low, powerful instrument of tragedy, is to speak of a life of quiet dignity and profound intellect. Her eulogy was a masterpiece. It was a sweeping, epic tribute that was both deeply moving and in its own way, a work of profound fiction. She spoke of his birth, of the joy he had brought into their lives. She spoke of his first steps, his first words. She spoke of his brilliance at school, of the awards he had won, of the respect he had earned from his colleagues as a distinguished professor. He was a man who found his truest joy not in the loud, ostentatious things of the world, she said, but in the quiet pursuit of knowledge. His library was his sanctuary. His books were his companions. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from making a sound. His companions. This man, my husband, who loved loud, messy dinner parties, who would dance with me in the kitchen to old soul music, who loved to travel and get lost in new cities, was being painted as a reclusive, joyless academic. In his later years, she said, and my entire body tensed. He found a sense of peace. He settled into a life of comfortable routine. He devoted himself to his teaching, and he found great companionship in his beloved dog, Winston. Winston. She mentioned the golden retriever we had adopted together before she mentioned me. The collective gasp that I felt in my own soul was echoed by the subtle shifting and murmuring of our friends in the pews behind me. They knew us. They had been to our home. They knew our love story. And they were all listening to this bizarre, sanitized, wifeless version of Liam's life. Their confusion a palpable thing in the air. I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel their pity. I could feel their second-hand humiliation. I stared straight ahead at the casket, at the ridiculous spray of white lilies on top of it, and I focused on my breathing. In, out, in, out. I remembered Liam's words from that day in Mr. Abernathy's office. Let them show their true colors. Eliza, let them give their performance. We'll write the final act. This was their performance, and with every word they spoke, with every year of my life they erased. They were walking deeper and deeper into the trap we had set for them. My silence was not submission. It was ammunition. Margaret finished her grand, sweeping, 10-year omission-filled eulogy with a final, tearful flourish. He was my son, my brilliant, wonderful boy, and we will miss him every day for the rest of our lives. Goodbye, my sweet Liam. She returned to the pew, her shoulders heaving with performative sobs, and collapsed into Charlotte's waiting arms. The two of them clung to each other, the two sole mourners of the man they had just invented. The rest of the service was a blur. When it was over, we were led to a reception in the church hall. I stood in a receiving line. Trapped between the two of them, it was excruciating. One by one, our friends and family came to offer their condolences, their faces a mixture of sympathy and bewilderment. Eliza, I'm so sorry for your loss. One of my dear friends, a woman who had been at our wedding, whispered, her eyes full of confusion. The service was beautiful, but I don't understand. Thank you for coming, Maria, I said, my voice quiet but steady. Liam loved you and John very much. I refused to acknowledge the insult. I refused to let them see my pain. I was a serene, grieving widow. My composure was a shield, and it seemed to unnerve Margaret and Charlotte more than any outburst could have. They had expected hysterics. They had expected a scene, which they could have dismissed as the unseemly display of a grieving, unstable woman. My quiet dignity was a language they didn't speak. Finally, the reception was over. The last of the guests had gone. We returned to my house, the house that was now so quiet it ached. Margaret and Charlotte came with me, ostensibly to make sure I was all right, but in reality, to continue their occupation. Well, Margaret said, looking around my living room with a critical eye, that's done. The service was lovely, I think. A fitting tribute. Yes, Charlotte agreed. I think he would have been pleased. I just looked at them. I looked at these two women who had stood up in a church and systematically, publicly, and cruelly attempted to erase me from the memory of the man I loved. They had delivered the ultimate insult, the final act of disrespect. And they thought they had gotten away with it. They thought they had won. That night, alone in the bed I had shared with my husband for a decade, I didn't cry. The tears were gone, burned away by a cold, hard resolve. I thought about the documents locked away in Mr. Abernathy's safe. I thought about the conversation Liam and I had, the promise we had made to each other. The funeral was over. Their performance was complete. The evidence had been presented, in front of hundreds of witnesses. All I had to do now was wait for the final act. All I had to do was wait for the reading of the will. The week between the funeral and the reading of the will was the longest week of my life. My home, our beautiful, sun-filled sanctuary, became an occupied territory. Margaret and Charlotte, under the guise of helping me through my grief, moved in. They were a constant, suffocating presence. Two black-clad vultures circling what they believed was a dying animal. They didn't see me as a grieving widow. They saw me as a temporary administrator, a placeholder who was keeping their rightful property warm until the legalities could be sorted out. Their conversations were a masterclass in presumptuous greed, always conducted just loud enough for me to overhear. "Mother, that beautiful mahogany desk in Liam's study," Charlotte would say, running her hand over its polished surface. "It would be a perfect fit in my husband's office. You know how much he's admired it." "Of course, darling," Margaret would reply, picking up a small, valuable first edition book from Liam's shelves. And this collection of British histories, Liam would have wanted me to have them. He knew how I treasured his intellect. They went through his closets, touching his clothes, his watches, his life, with the acquisitive hands of estate sale shoppers. They were dividing the spoils of a man who was barely cold in his grave, a man they claimed to love more than anyone. I said nothing. I moved through my own home like a ghost, my grief a thick, soundproof wall around me. I would make coffee, sit in the garden Liam and I had planted together, and I would let their chatter wash over me, my silence, my lack of protest. Made them bold. They mistook my profound, all-consuming sadness for weakness. They mistook my patience for passivity. They had no idea that my silence was a strategy, a key component of a plan my husband and I had set in motion over a year ago, the memory that kept me sane, the memory I clung to like a life raft in an ocean of their disrespect, was from a rainy Tuesday in April. It was triggered by Charlotte, of course. She had picked up a framed photo from the mantelpiece. It was our wedding photo, me and Liam, so young, so ridiculously happy, grinning at the camera without a clue of the challenges ahead. "You were so beautiful on that day." "Eliza," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with a pity that was more insulting than any slur. "A real fairy tale. Of course. You had no idea what you were really getting into, did you? The pressures of being a Davenport wife. It's a role that requires a certain fortitude." The condescension in her voice, the implication that I was a naive commoner who had accidentally stumbled into a world far beyond her comprehension, was the spark, and my mind flashed back to another time they had underestimated me. Another time they had made their assumptions clear. It was the day Liam and I decided to fight back. The flashback began. It had been after a disastrous Christmas dinner. A year before Liam died, Charlotte, half drunk on expensive champagne, had made one of her signature jokes. Liam had just announced that he was funding a scholarship for underprivileged students at his university. Oh, how noble, Charlotte had trilled, wasting good money on lost causes. "You're lucky you have Eliza. She's so practical. She'll probably find a way to make a profit from it. You know what they say. You can take the girl out of the middle class." But Liam had slammed his hand on the table. The china had rattled. "That's enough," he'd said, his voice dangerously quiet. The fight had been ugly, ending with us leaving early and his mother calling the next day to accuse me of driving a wedge in their family. That night, Liam couldn't sleep. He sat in our living room, staring into the fire. "They're never going to stop, are they?" he said, his voice full of a weary resignation. "They will never see you as my partner. They will only ever see you as a threat to their inheritance." He looked at me, his eyes full of a fierce, protective love that made my heart ache. "And it terrifies me to think of what they would do if I weren't here to protect you." "I can protect myself, Liam," I had told him. "I know you can," he said. "You're the strongest person I know, but I don't want you to have to fight them alone, not when I'm gone. I want my will to be my final word, my final act as your husband. I want it to be a shield for you." He explained his idea then, a morality clause. He called it an unorthodox, legally complex, and utterly brilliant idea. The following week, we were sitting in the quiet, book-lined office of our lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. He was a kind, old-school gentleman, with a sharp mind and a calming presence. We laid out the plan. Liam did most of the talking. "Mr. Abernathy," he'd said, "I want to add a codicil to my will, my primary heir, as it stands now. is my wife, Eliza. That will not change. But the portion of my estate that is designated for my mother and my sister, I want to make that inheritance conditional. Mr. Abernathy raised a skeptical eyebrow. Conditional. That can be a very tricky thing to enforce. Liam? I'm aware, Liam said. But hear me out. My family, as you know, has never fully accepted my wife. I am concerned that upon my death, they will use the occasion of their grief to disrespect her, to minimize her role in my life, to effectively erase her. I want to build in a consequence for that specific behavior. Together, we spent the next hour drafting the clause. It was a collaborative effort. Liam laid out the broad strokes, and I, with my eye for detail and my intimate knowledge of their specific brand of cruelty, helped refine the language. This was the part of the will that I wrote. Liam dictated the core of it. My inheritance for my mother, Margaret Davenport, and my sister, Charlotte Davenport, is contingent upon a single, vital condition that in the period following my death, they treat my beloved wife, Eliza Vance, with the dignity, love, and respect she is owed as my widow and as the most important person in my life. Mr. Abernathy looked concerned. That language is very subjective. Liam, dignity, respect. How is that to be judged? That's the next part, Liam said, a grim smile on his face. And this was my contribution. I had suggested the mechanism that would make it legally binding, the sole and indisputable authority to judge whether this condition has been met. I had dictated, and Mr. Abernathy had typed, shall be granted to the executor of this will. His judgment on the matter will be final and cannot be contested by any party. Mr. Abernathy stopped typing. He looked at us over the top of his spectacles. You want me to be the judge and jury of your family's behavior? Yes, Liam said simply. I trust your judgment implicitly. You have known my family for 30 years. You know who they are. You will be at the funeral. You will see how they behave. You will be a neutral, unimpeachable witness. Mr. Abernathy sighed. This is highly unorthodox. Our family is highly unorthodox, I had replied quietly. He nodded slowly, a look of understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew them. He knew exactly what we were talking about. And what, he asked, is the consequence if, in my judgment, they fail to meet this condition? Liam looked at me, and I looked back at him. This was the final, devastating piece of our plan. If they fail the test, Liam said, his voice firm, then the entirety of their designated inheritance, the stocks, the property, the share of the estate is to be immediately forfeited. It is to be donated, in its entirety, to a single charity of my wife's choosing. We had done it. We had built our shield, our secret weapon. It was a perfect, elegant trap. And the only bait was their own predictable, consistent cruelty. All they had to do to inherit millions was be decent, respectful human beings to the woman their son and brother had loved. And we both knew, with a sad certainty, that it was a test they were almost guaranteed to fail. As we left his office that day, I had felt a strange mixture of profound love for my husband and profound sadness that such a measure was even necessary. I hope it never comes to this, I'd whispered to him. Me too, he'd said, squeezing my hand, but if it does, I'm glad we'll be facing them together, one last time. The flashback ended. I was back in my living room, the memory as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. Charlotte was still holding our wedding photo, her expression one of pitying disdain. It's a shame, really, she said, putting the photo back on the mantelpiece with a dismissive little clink. He could have had anyone, but he chose you. I just looked at her. I didn't see my tormentor anymore. I saw a woman standing on a trapdoor, completely unaware of the lever that was about to be pulled. I felt nothing but a distant, cold calm. The phone call came on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the funeral. It was Victoria, Mr. Abernathy's assistant. Her voice was professional and kind. Missy Vance, she said, Mr. Abernathy has scheduled the reading of your late husband's last will and testament for this coming Monday at 2 p.m. We trust this time is convenient for you. Margaret and Charlotte, who were in the kitchen making a great show of sorting through my pantry and judging my choice of olive oil, both froze. Their heads snapped in my direction, their eyes wide and gleaming with avarice. This was the moment they had been waiting for, payday, the day their inheritance would be confirmed. and the inconvenient widow would finally be put in her place. "Yes, Victoria," I said, my voice perfectly even. "That time is perfect. We will be there." I hung up the phone. I looked at the two women across the room. Their faces were alight with triumphant, greedy smiles. They thought they were about to witness my final defeat. They had no idea they were about to attend their own execution. The day of the will reading dawned gray and cold, just like every day since Liam had died. But this morning, the cold felt different. It wasn't just the weather, it was a cold, hard sense of purpose that had settled deep in my bones. The period of passive grief was over. Today was the beginning of the final act. I got dressed with deliberate care. I didn't choose a simple, black morning dress. I chose a dark charcoal gray suit, the one I wore to important business meetings. It was my armor. It was a statement. I was not coming to this meeting as a helpless, grieving widow. I was coming as Liam's partner, prepared to execute the last business plan we had ever created together. The drive to Mr. Abernathy's office was quiet. I felt a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes when you know a storm is about to break. There was nothing more to do, nothing more to say. The pieces were all in place. All that was left was to watch them fall. The law offices of Abernathy, Cole, and Finch were old school. A world of hushed corridors, antique rugs, and the comforting smell of leather and old paper. I was shown into a small, elegant waiting room. I was the first to arrive. A few minutes later, Margaret and Charlotte swept in. They were a vision in coordinated, expensive-looking black wool. They looked less like they were attending a will reading and more like they were attending the opening of a particularly somber art gallery. They saw me sitting there and their faces registered a flicker of surprise, as if they hadn't really expected me to show up. "Eliza, dear," Margaret said, her voice full of a syrupy, condescending sympathy. "So good of you to come. I know this must all be so terribly confusing and overwhelming for you. Don't you worry. We'll make sure everything is handled properly." "Yes," Charlotte added, looking me up and down, her eyes lingering for a moment on my business suit. "We'll get through the formalities, and then we can all begin the process of moving on." The message was clear. They were the adults, the ones in charge. I was the confused child who needed to be managed. They were already planning my exit, not just from their lives, but from the life I had built with their son and brother. I just nodded politely, my silence a blank wall they couldn't penetrate. Their confidence was so absolute, so unshakable. It was almost beautiful in its arrogance. We were shown into Mr. Abernathy's office. It was a room that commanded respect, lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound law books. A large mahogany desk stood like a judge's bench at one end. Mr. Abernathy, a kind man in his 70s with sharp, intelligent eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles, stood up as I entered. "Eliza," he said, his voice full of a genuine gentle warmth as he shook my hand. "I am so deeply sorry for your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," I said. His demeanor shifted to one of cool professionalism as he greeted Margaret and Charlotte. He was the executor of the will, and in this room, his authority was absolute. We all took our seats in the heavy leather chairs positioned in front of his desk. The lion's den. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. Margaret and Charlotte sat perched on the edge of their seats, their faces masks of eager, greedy anticipation. Mr. Abernathy put on his glasses and picked up a thick document bound in a blue legal cover. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice formal and solemn, "for the reading of the last will and testament of Liam Richard Davenport, executed on the 3rd of March, 2022. He cleared his throat. "I, Liam Richard Davenport, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills and codicils." He started with the minor bequests. There was a collection of antique maps left to his old university. There was a generous donation to the local animal shelter where we had adopted our dog, Winston. There were small, thoughtful monetary gifts left to a few of his former graduate students whose work he had admired. I watched Margaret and Charlotte as he read these clauses. They were growing impatient, shifting in their seats, their polite smiles strained. This was all just preamble to them, the boring opening acts before the main event. Then, Mr. Abernathy got to the section they had been waiting for. To my beloved mother, Margaret Davenport, he read. I leave my complete collection of first edition texts on British history as a testament to the love of learning she instilled in me. I also bequeath to her, for her care and comfort, a sum of $1 million to be disbursed from my estate. Margaret's eyes lit up. She gave a small, satisfied nod, as if this was her proper and expected due. To my dear sister, Charlotte Davenport, Mr. Abernathy continued. I leave our family's summer property in the Hamptons, in the hope that she will find as much peace there as I did. I also bequeath to her a sum of $1 million to be disbursed from my estate. Charlotte's face broke into a wide, triumphant grin. She shot me a quick, smug glance. See her look said, this is how it's done. This is how a Davenport provides for his family. They thought this was it. They had gotten their property, their money. Now all that was left was to deal with me, the inconvenient widow. Mr. Abernathy paused. He took a sip of water, then he continued to the final main section of the will. All the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate, both real and personal, of whatsoever kind and wheresoever situated, I give, devise, and bequeath to my beloved wife, Eliza Vance. He looked up at me as he said my name, his eyes full of a quiet kindness. She is the partner of my life, the center of my world, and my greatest and most enduring joy. I leave to her our primary residence and all personal effects therein, the entirety of my stock portfolio, my investment accounts, and all other assets, to be hers absolutely and forever. It is my greatest wish that she use these resources to live a life of happiness, adventure, and purpose, a life that we had always planned to live together. I felt a fresh wave of grief wash over me, hearing Liam's love for me articulated so clearly, so beautifully. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I had to clench my jaw to keep my composure. But Margaret and Charlotte were not moved. They were incensed. I heard Charlotte let out a small, sharp hiss of air through her teeth. She leaned over and whispered to her mother, her voice a low, venomous buzz that was clearly intended for me to hear. Don't worry, Mother, she said. This is exactly what we expected. It's a textbook case of undue influence. He clearly wasn't in his right mind when he wrote this. Our lawyers will have a field day with it. We'll have it overturned in 6 months. Margaret just nodded, a grim, determined look on her face. They were so sure of themselves, so confident in their own power and the power of their high-priced lawyers. They truly believed that my husband's last wishes were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, a legal hurdle they could easily overcome. They had no idea what was coming. They had not yet heard the ghost in the will. Mr. Abernathy finished reading the clause and set the main document down. He looked at the three of us, his expression unreadable. Margaret, already moving into her role as the new matriarch in charge, began to gather her purse. Well, she said briskly, thank you. Mr. Abernathy, that seems to be all. We will have our legal team contact you in the coming days to begin the process of reviewing the estate's distribution. She was already talking like it was her estate to distribute. Mr. Abernathy did not move. He simply held up a single, calming hand. Not just yet, Margaret, he said, his voice quiet but firm. That concludes the reading of the primary will. It's true. He paused, letting the silence in the room build. He reached for a separate, single sheet of paper that was lying on his desk. However, he said, his eyes finding mine for a brief, significant second. There is one final matter to attend to. A codicil. It was added to the will on April 17th of last year, and its terms supersede all others. I watched the color drain from Charlotte's face. I saw the confident, smug expression on Margaret's face falter, replaced by a new look of confusion and dawning, uncertain dread. They didn't know what was coming, but they knew, in that single, terrible moment, that the game had just changed. The trap was about to be sprung. The air in Mr. Abernathy's office became thin and sharp, charged with a sudden, palpable dread. Margaret and Charlotte, who moments before had been preening with the confidence of heiresses, were now frozen in their chairs. Their faces, which had been masks of smug satisfaction, were now canvases of pure, bewildered panic. A codicil. A final chapter they didn't know had been written. Mr. Abernathy placed the main will aside. He picked up the single sheet of paper, adjusted his glasses, and looked at them with an expression of solemn gravity. He was no longer just a lawyer reading a document. He was an executioner, preparing to read a verdict. This codicil, he began, his voice slow and deliberate, was drafted, signed, and witnessed on April 17th of last year. It is the final and superseding addendum to Liam's will. He cleared his throat and began to read. And as he spoke, it was not his voice I heard, but my husband's. It was Liam's final letter, his last act of love, his final, devastating lesson. To my mother, Margaret, and my sister, Charlotte, Mr. Abernathy read. And the words filled the room with a power that was both heartbreaking and absolute. I love you both. I hope you never have to hear these words read to you. I hope that, in my absence, you find it in your hearts to finally embrace the woman I chose as my partner, my equal, and the great love of my life. But I have known you my entire life, and so I must plan for the reality of who you are, not the ideal of who I wish you were. I watched their faces as Mr. Abernathy read. The confusion was turning to horror. This was not the language of a standard will. This was personal. This was a judgment. You have, for the duration of my marriage, viewed my wife, Eliza, as an outsider, a temporary inconvenience, and, most insultingly, as a financial opportunist. Liam's words continued, each one a perfectly aimed arrow. You have never understood the nature of our relationship. Eliza was not just my wife. She was my co-author in the story of my life. Our love was not a footnote. It was the central theme. Therefore, any attempt to diminish her, to erase her, is a fundamental desecration of my memory and my life's work, which was, above all, to love her well. I felt a sob catch in my throat. To hear his love and his defense of me articulated so clearly, so powerfully, from beyond the grave, it was an agony and a comfort unlike any I had ever known. Therefore, Mr. Abernathy read, his voice resonating with a new gravity, I am making the inheritance designated for you in the main body of my will conditional. Your receiving of any property or funds from my estate is entirely contingent upon a single, vital condition that in the period immediately following my death, from the moment of my passing to the reading of this will, you treat my beloved wife, Eliza Vance, with the honor, dignity, love, and respect she is owed as my widow. You must, in your words and your actions, publicly and privately, acknowledge her as the center of my world and the matriarch of the family that she and I built together. Charlotte let out a small, strangled gasp. Margaret looked as if she had been turned to stone. To ensure this condition is judged fairly and without prejudice, Mr. Abernathy continued, reading the part of the will I had helped write, the part that would be their undoing, I grant my executor, Mr. David Abernathy, the sole and indisputable authority to judge whether this condition has been met. His judgment on this matter, based on his own observations, will be final and cannot be contested by any party. Mr. Abernathy finished reading the paragraph. He carefully placed the codicil down on his desk. He took off his glasses and began to polish them slowly with a handkerchief. The small, repetitive motion was the only sound in the suffocatingly silent room. Then, he put his glasses back on. He looked directly at Margaret and Charlotte. He was no longer the reader. He was the judge. Margaret, Charlotte, he began, his voice now his own, filled with a quiet, somber authority. I have been your family's lawyer for over 30 years. I considered Liam not just a client, but a dear friend. I was, as you know, present at his funeral last Tuesday. He let that statement hang in the air. I sat in the second pew. I listened with great interest to the eulogies you both delivered. They were very moving. He paused. I listened to you. Charlotte, speak for 10 minutes about your brother's childhood, a bond you described as profound. I listened to you. Margaret, speak for nearly 15 minutes about his life as a son, a scholar, and a community member. You spoke of his birth, his academic awards, his charitable donations. You even spoke fondly of his dog, Winston. He leaned forward, his expression hardening. In all that time, In the combined 25 minutes that you stood before a church full of his friends and family and claimed to be summarizing his life, neither of you saw fit to mention the name Eliza a single time. Their faces, already pale, turned a ghastly shade of white. You did not acknowledge their 10-year marriage, he continued, his voice a relentless, factual indictment. You did not mention her role as his loving partner. You did not reference her as his companion, his confidant, or as the woman who held his hand through his final hours. You did not just omit her. You deliberately, publicly, and maliciously erased the most important person in your son and brother's life from his own story. It was an act of disrespect so profound, so complete, that it can only be described as a failure of character. He leaned back in his chair. Therefore, in my capacity as executor of this estate, and using the sole and indisputable discretion granted to me by the decedent, I have made my judgment. He looked at them with eyes that held no pity. You have failed, completely and spectacularly, to meet the conditions of this codicil. Charlotte finally broke. This is insane, she shrieked, jumping to her feet. This isn't legal. You can't do this. He was manipulated. She wrote this, didn't she? That little gold-digging witch will sue you, will sue her, will have you disbarred. Mr. Abernathy didn't even flinch. He simply picked up the codicil again. Before you continue, Charlotte, perhaps you should hear the final sentence of the clause, he said calmly. He read from the paper, his voice cutting through her tirade. In the event that this condition is not met, as judged by my executor, I direct that the entirety of the bequests made to my mother, Margaret Davenport, and my sister, Charlotte Davenport, including all monetary funds, properties, and personal effects, be immediately and irrevocably forfeited. He paused, then delivered the final, devastating blow. Said forfeited assets shall be donated, in their entirety, to a registered 501c3 charitable organization, to be chosen at the sole and indisputable discretion of my wife, Eliza Vance. The room exploded. No, Margaret screamed, finally finding her voice. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure rage and greed. You will not. That is our money, our family's legacy. She will not get her hands on it. I'm afraid you misunderstand, Margaret, Mr. Abernathy said calmly. Ms. Vance will not get her hands on it. She will simply be deciding which charity will, the Hamptons property, the first editions, the $2 million in trust funds. It is all forfeited. The will is ironclad. Liam was very specific. The language is clear. My discretion is, and I quote, indisputable and cannot be contested. Any legal challenge you mount will be a costly, public, and ultimately futile exercise. The decision is final. They stared at him, their faces masks of apoplectic rage and utter disbelief. They had walked into this office expecting to divide a kingdom. They were walking out with nothing but their own toxic bitterness. Their attempt to erase me from Liam's life had resulted in them being erased from his will. It was a perfect, poetic, and devastating justice. I sat there through it all, silent. My heart ached with the fresh grief of hearing Liam's love for me so powerfully articulated. But beneath the grief, there was a fierce, triumphant pride. We had done it, our last act as a team. He had known, even in his life, that they would try to hurt me in his death, and he had built me this final, perfect shield. He had protected me, even from beyond the grave. Margaret and Charlotte were still sputtering, threatening, their words turning into pathetic, impotent noise. Mr. Abernathy stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. I believe we are done here, he said, as they stormed out of the office, their faces contorted with hate. Charlotte turned to me one last time. You will regret this, she hissed. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a distant pity. No, Charlotte, I said, my voice quiet but strong. You will. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving me alone with Mr. Abernathy in the quiet, book-lined room. He looked at me, a small, sad smile on his face. He was a good man. Eliza, he loved you very much. I know, I whispered. So, he said, gesturing to the will, you have a decision to make. You have $2 million, a beach house, and a collection of rare books to donate to a worthy cause. Any initial thoughts? A slow smile spread across my face. It was the first genuine smile I'd had in weeks. An idea, a perfect, final, poetic idea, was already forming in my mind. As a matter of fact, Mr. Abernathy, I said, I have one or two. In the heavy, ringing silence of Mr. Abernathy's office, after the Davenports had stormed out, I felt the last year of tension drain out of my body. I was left with two competing, overwhelming emotions: the profound, aching grief of my husband's absence, and the fierce, triumphant love for the man who had protected me, even from beyond the grave. A charity of your choosing, Eliza, Mr. Abernathy said again, his voice gentle, pulling me from my thoughts. It's a significant sum. Take your time to decide. But I didn't need time. I knew instantly. The perfect, most poetic, most fitting choice had bloomed in my mind the moment Mr. Abernathy read the final clause. I've decided, I said, a slow, sure smile spreading across my face. It was the first genuine smile I'd had since Liam died. There's a small, struggling local foundation that supports emerging contemporary artists, the kind of bold, provocative, modern art that my mother-in-law once famously described as a waste of good canvas. They're about to lose their gallery space. Mr. Abernathy's eyes twinkled behind his glasses. He understood immediately. I want to donate the entire sum to them. I continued, but with one condition. The donation is to be used to purchase a new, permanent gallery space and to establish an annual grant. And I want it to be named the Liam Davenport Grant for Unconventional Art, using his name, the name Margaret and Charlotte held so sacred, to fund the very art they so publicly despised. It was the most fitting tribute I could imagine. It was a final, perfect testament to Liam's own rebellious, intellectual spirit, and a final, crushing repudiation of their narrow, materialistic world. Liam would have loved it. The weeks that followed were exactly as Mr. Abernathy had predicted. Margaret and Charlotte, true to form, hired a team of expensive, aggressive lawyers who sent a flurry of threatening letters. They contested the will on every imaginable ground: lack of testamentary capacity, undue influence, mine, of course, and claimed the codicil was legally and morally unenforceable. Mr. Abernathy handled it all with a calm, unassailable professionalism. He would forward me the letters with a single dry comment attached more noise. He responded to their legal team with a simple, polite letter of his own, in which he quoted the sole and indisputable discretion clause, and respectfully informed them that any legal challenge would be met with the full resources of his firm, and that he would, if subpoenaed, be legally obligated to present his detailed, contemporaneous notes on their behavior following Liam's death, including their conduct at the funeral. Their lawyers, faced with a will so perfectly constructed and a witness as unimpeachable as Mr. Abernathy, quickly advised them that their case was hopeless. Their legal threats sputtered and died. A final, impotent display of their rage. Their social punishment was, from what I heard, far more effective. The story, as these things do in small, wealthy circles, got out, not the details of the will, but the details of the eulogy. Friends who had been there, who had witnessed the public erasure of a 10-year marriage, began to talk. The story of Margaret and Charlotte's cruelty, followed by their stunning disinheritance, became a quiet, delicious scandal whispered over cocktails at the country club they could no longer afford. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of public image and social standing, and in one afternoon of unrestrained hubris, they had demolished it themselves. They had lost their son, their inheritance, and their reputation. All they had left was each other, and I couldn't imagine a more fitting punishment. A year has passed. The grief for Liam is still a part of me. It is not a raw, open wound anymore, but a quiet, tender place in my heart. It is the price of a great love, and I have learned to carry it not as a burden, but as a testament to what we shared. I still live in our house at first. The silence was deafening, but slowly I have filled it with life again, my life. I took down the heavy velvet drapes his mother had insisted upon and let the sunlight pour in. I painted the walls in warm, bright colors. I planted a chaotic, beautiful garden full of sunflowers in the backyard. The house is no longer a museum of my grief. It is a home, filled with my work, my friends, and the lingering, happy memory of the man I loved. The Liam Davenport Grant for Unconventional Art is thriving. Last month, I attended the opening of their new gallery, a beautiful, light-filled space in the heart of the city's arts district. The inaugural exhibition was a collection of bold, challenging, and brilliant pieces from young artists who would have otherwise never had the chance to be seen. One of the pieces, the winner of the first grant, was a massive, chaotic, and breathtakingly beautiful sculpture made entirely of shattered and reconstructed glass. Its title was Kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold. Embracing the cracks as part of the object's history, standing in front of it, I felt a profound sense of peace. It was perfect. My life is quiet now, but it is not small. It is a life lived on my own terms, a life of purpose. I run the foundation in Liam's name, ensuring his legacy is not one of dusty first editions in a locked room, but one of vibrant, living creativity. I have come to understand what Liam's final act truly was. The codicil wasn't just a trap to punish his family's greed. It was his ultimate act of empowerment for me. He knew they would try to hurt me. He knew they would try to control the narrative. And he knew that the only way for me to truly be free was to have the power to write the final chapter myself. He didn't just leave me his money. He left me a choice. He left me the power to define his legacy. They thought his legacy was his name, his property, his stock portfolio. They were wrong. His legacy was his kindness, his intellect, his rebellious spirit, and the deep, abiding love we shared. In the end, I didn't need their forfeited inheritance. I was already the richest woman in the world, because I had been loved by him, but using their money to fund everything they despised. To create beauty and opportunity in his name, that was just poetic justice. And I know, somewhere, he is laughing. So I leave you with this. The end of a life is a tragedy, but the legacy of a life is a choice. We get to choose how we remember the people we love. We get to choose what parts of their story we carry forward. Don't let anyone else write that story for you. Thank you for letting me share my story and Liam's. If you've ever had to fight to protect the memory and the truth of someone you loved, I see you. Tell me in the comments how you choose to honor the legacies in your own life. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe in the power of a life well lived and a love that is stronger than death. And remember, the richest inheritance isn't found in a will, it's found in the love you give, the integrity you maintain. And sometimes, if you're lucky, in a little bit of perfectly executed, posthumous poetic justice.